It is really a pleasure to welcome you all and to moderate this panel of very distinguished group of academics and practitioners. We have Jose Antonio Campo, who I'm sure needs no introduction with you. He's professor at Columbia University, former UN Undersecretary General of Economic and Social Affairs, former Minister of Finance of Colombia, former Secretary General of ECLAC, CEPAL, and I think I'm missing several formers there. Jonathan Ostry is Deputy Director of the Research Department of the IMF. He has held several senior positions at the IMF, including leading country teams on Japan and several Asian countries, and leading the team that produces the IMF's flagship World Economic Outlook. Peter Bagvis is Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the International Trade Union Confederation and Global Unions. And finally, we have my colleague, Isabel Ortiz, Director of the Social Protection Department at the ILO, based in Geneva. Earlier, she was Director of Policy at UNICEF and Senior Official at the United Nations DESA and the Asian Development Bank, among other positions. So, as one looks at the title of this session, I cannot really help to think that this is probably one of the most difficult and complex conversations of all the ones that are taking place during the annual meetings, because this panel is going to talk about three formidable challenges: social protection, inequality, and growth, and the links between them, and all of this in times of fiscal consolidation. So this is really a complex set of issues with many connections. So I just want to say a few comments, starting with inequality. As you know, Latin America is famous for being the most unequal region on Earth. Although we continue to have these characteristics, as you all know, something extraordinary really happened in the last decade and a half. As inequality was rising in nearly every part of the world, it has been declining in almost every Latin American country since the year 2000. It fell in countries with high growth, such as Chile and Colombia, but also in countries with modest growth, such as Brazil and Mexico. It fell in countries governed by left-leaning regimes, such as Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, El Salvador, and others. We'll get into the discussion whether characterization of left-leaning is correct or not. And in countries with center or center-right regimes, I won't mention any. It fell in commodity exporting countries and commodity importers, in countries with minimum wages on the rise, and in countries with stagnant minimum wages. Therefore, the task of explaining the causes of the declining inequality in Latin America is really daunting, but at the same time extremely important. Was it due simply to the impact of the high growth rates of the decade, or the favorable terms of trade? Was it due to the track that this had on labor markets and on poverty reduction? Was it due to the decline in the returns to education and to the wage skill premium, or to other elements of labor income, such as the relative demand for skilled and unskilled labor, or the very substantial increase in the supply of tertiary education? Was it due to the new policy models associated with social democratic or more populist governments, such as the expansion of social protection systems and cash transfer schemes and other social transfers, or to changes in the tax systems? So it doesn't really matter how you approach the issue or which of these questions you try to answer. The fact is that the interaction between the three blocks in the title of this session, inequality, in the case of Latin America, the reduction in inequality, social protection, and growth, is really at the center of this question, extremely important. And it is these interactions that we are now going to discuss, or we are going to hear our panelists talking about. Needless to say, the policy lessons and conclusions around these questions are absolutely fundamental for policy formulation going forward. So this discussion is not just academic, it is extremely practical and very useful. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker to take the floor, and this will be Mr. Jonathan Ostry, who will talk to us about redistribution, inequality, and growth, in particular the very important question of whether efforts to redistribute may undermine growth.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Salazar. I think you've set the context very, very well. I'm not going to cover everything that I think your introductory remarks speak to. In particular, the environment of fiscal consolidation, I think indeed is very important. I think there's been a lot of work suggesting that fiscal consolidation can be very bad for inequality, can be very bad for the poor, but I don't think that connection is inevitable, and I think some of the more recent episodes of fiscal consolidation, when the governments have been concerned to short-circuit that link with inequality and the poor, have yielded some good results, and I think some recent IMF work on this speaks to improvements in that connection. I'm also not going to talk about the causes of inequality. I think your remarks sort of suggest that inequality and growth correlations can go in any direction, and I think that's an important point to recognize. To me, it links up with the idea that there can be good inequality and bad inequality. I think if you go back to an earlier period when, for example, China was opening up, they had a big pickup in growth as the market as the system was more subject to market forces, and also a big increase in inequality. I think that was probably in the nature of good inequality. I think on the other side, when Lula came to power in Brazil and was very concerned about the rise in inequality that had taken place in earlier periods in his country, he took very important steps to arrest and reverse that decline while still keeping the economy growing well. And so I think there you can see that you can have strong growth with declining inequality, and the decline is welcome because it was probably excessive inequality to begin with. So you see everything, both sides, and you really have to look at country circumstances. I am going to talk about macroeconomic issues because I come from an institution that's focused on macro. I think just to sort of give you the background, we've been working on this for nearly 10 years now, and the origin of the sort of series of papers that I'm going to talk about really came in a meeting with a former managing director of the fund, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, where the issues of the day were really had to do with the Arab Spring, with the Occupy movements. And he remarked that the issues that the demonstrators on the street were talking about seemed to be central issues for globalization. And yet the IMF is supposed to be advising countries on how to meet challenges posed by globalization. But what the people on the street were talking about did not seem central to the IMF's mandate. So I suggested in this meeting that one way to make these issues central was to draw a connection between the issues that they were talking about and something that was core to the mandate of the fund, which is indeed macro stability and economic growth and the stability of economic growth, the sustainability of economic growth. He liked the idea and said, go away and write something up. And so we produced this first paper a few years ago now that suggested that inequality and unstable or fragile growth might be two sides of the same coin. So that a high level of inequality made you more prone to have short-lived growth episodes, not sustained growth, whereas greater equality seemed to go hand in hand with more stable, more prolonged sustained growth episodes. And this is very important for a large segment of our membership, including developing and emerging market countries, because what separates, it turns out that it's rather easy to get growth going, but it's rather difficult to keep growth going. And what separates countries that are being successful over the long haul in closing the gap with frontier countries in terms of income per capita is the duration of their growth episodes, the ability to keep growth going for 5, 10, 15, 20 years at a healthy level, not short-lived growth spurts which can occur in countries with otherwise pretty weak economic and political institutions, and these episodes tend to peter out. Now, the point of departure for my talk today is kind of people said, sure, that's great that equality belongs in the pantheon of factors that economists and political scientists believe is important for the longer run health of economies, but what to be done about it? In particular, is it the case that a sort of obvious cure for inequality, namely redistribution, might be a cure that is worse than the disease itself? And indeed, there's a very proud tradition in economics, and I think even Tom Sargent, in one of his post-Nobel talks, identified the distortion of incentives as one of the great economic truths, that distorting incentives through redistributive measures can indeed be very antithetical for economic efficiency and growth. And so, I have my PhD from the University of Chicago, so I learned to love inequality before I learned to hate it. Really, this is a proud tradition in economics. Arthur Okun wrote a book several decades ago that spoke about a leaky bucket, that you may, for moral or social reasons, want to take from the rich and give to the poor, but in doing so, you lose something, and what you lose is the economy's ability to grow in a sustained way. You lose economic efficiency. If that's true, then redistribution might be a cure that is worse than the disease. And really, if you're going to analyze that question, you really need a nested approach. You need an approach where you're going to look at both growth, inequality, and redistribution all together. Because remember, there is quite a lot of evidence, not just in our paper, but in the literature more broadly, that, as I said, equality is helpful for economic growth, both the level of economic growth and the sustainability of economic growth. Even if redistribution hurts growth through these incentive effects, if it helps equality, remember, you're not doing redistributive policies to help economic growth. You're doing them to deal with inequality. So if it helps inequality, and inequality is antithetical to growth, when you do redistributive policies, there are two effects. There may be a direct effect that's harmful, and there is an indirect effect which is helpful, i.e. you improve equality, and that's good for whatever your moral and social agenda is, but it's also good for economic growth. So there's a potential conflict between a direct and indirect effect, and it's really an empirical issue as to which one of those forces is going to win out. So what we do is we follow two approaches. As I said, it's an empirical matter to try and disentangle these direct and indirect effects. We use two different, very different empirical techniques because people have very strong views and need a lot of convincing if you're going to buck the conventional wisdom in these areas. We use a very traditional economic growth approach, what economists call panel growth regressions, which essentially ask whether variables like openness to trade, openness to foreign capital, capital, and things like the distribution of income, whether changes in these over, say, on average over 5-year periods are associated with changes in economic performance those 5-year periods. So that's one approach. It's not a great approach, I think, for developing countries, because developing countries don't have sort of the smooth growth processes that a lot of rich world countries have. Their economic growth and economic performance is characterized by a lot of discontinuities in their economic growth performance: hills, valleys, plateaus, cliffs, and so forth. And so there we wanted to look at an alternative technique that is a little more robust to those issues, which is sustainability. We want to look at the hazard that a growth spell that you're in, a period of good economic performance, will end, and how that hazard is related to distributional issues as well as redistributive policies. I've talked about these issues, and so I'm going to race through a lot of the slides to keep within my deadline. Let me just say that, again, to emphasize, as a theoretical matter, equality can be either favorable or antithetical to growth. The incentive effects are very important, but on the other side, greater equality can lead to greater social cohesion, which can enable countries to better adjust to adverse shocks. It can lead to greater political stability, and political stability is the friend of investment. In societies that are more equal, it will tend to be the case that the less well-off will have better access to education, to health, to financial markets, to nutrition, and all of these things will be helpful to growth. So really, we don't know as a theoretical matter, and we need to look at what the data say. Now, it turns out that we were puzzled at the beginning. Why has nobody looked at these questions in a nested way? People have looked at the role of inequality, and they've looked at proxies for redistribution, namely the size of the state, the size of the tax take, the size of government spending, proxies for redistributive policies, but not a more direct measure of redistribution, which might be given by the difference between pre-tax and post-tax measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient. And when we asked ourselves, why hasn't anybody looked at this, it turned out that the data were not available. In 2009 and subsequently in the updated versions, a professor at the University of Iowa, Fred Solt, put together a very interesting database that is an essential database for anybody who wants to be looking at the role of both inequality and redistribution in a cross-country, multi-year kind of setup. These data are not perfect, but they are the state-of-the-art for these questions in a multi-country setting. And moreover, if you have questions about these data and believe that some of our results are driven by the poor quality of these data, I should stress here that we have run everything in our paper on alternative data sets for subsamples, including for the rich countries, where the gold standard data, the Luxembourg Ingham Survey data, produce effectively the very same results. So the results that I'm going to show you are not due to the data. What do the data say? Old story. Inequality has been worsening in the rich world and getting better in the developing world. Rich countries do a lot of redistribution, developing countries do some, and there's evidence that the more unequal your market incomes are, the more redistribution you tend to do. So that the 45-degree line in these graphs, and I apologize, they're so small, represent points of no redistribution, i.e. market and post-tax Ginis are the same, and movements away from the line represent redistributive policies. And you can see that the more to the right you are, especially in the rich countries, on the horizontal axis, the further away from the diagonal line you are as well. I want to have one very brief detour on what I said, that more unequal societies tend to redistribute more. This is a sort of political economy story that is quite well established in the literature, and the idea rests on the notion that political power is more equally distributed than economic power, so that when there, one man, one vote. When inequality gets to be very high, there'll be more pressure for redistributive policies. Indeed, we find some evidence for this. More so in the rich world than in the poor, than in the developing world, but we find it across the sample. It speaks a little bit to notions that in countries, for example, like the United States, there's often the charge that's levied that the political power is not more equally distributed than economic power, that the rich also control the political system and the political agenda and are able to pass regulations and policies that help them and hurt the poor. This is not the last word on that, but there is the evidence that we present here isn't overly supportive of that notion. People are going to have very different views about the power of econometrics, the power of economic analysis. So I want to spend 2 minutes on what the data say, the raw data. No econometrics, just what you see in these data. And what is suggestive here is that there is a negative relationship between the level of inequality and the growth that you experience over the upcoming decades, say. You can do this over different time periods. But there is absolutely no relationship between the amount of redistribution that you do and the size of the growth dividend that you experience over the next decade. Likewise, you can do the same thing about the duration of growth spells. You can ask if you have a lot of inequality at the beginning of a spell, is it likely to short circuit the duration of that spell? And the answer is it seems to be. But if you do a lot of redistribution at the beginning of a spell, does it have any really salience for the duration of the growth spell? Doesn't appear to be the case. The line in the right panel is pretty flat. Again, I'm going to zoom through and just give you a flavor of the empirical results. Two approaches, panels and hazard analysis, duration analysis. Basically, the story is the one that I told you at the outset, which is in a sort of very standard growth setup. If you ask the data, what is the effect of inequality on average growth, you get a very significant, sizable negative effect. If you ask the data, what is the effect of redistribution on average growth, you can't really detect anything. You can do this in a very simple model, and then you can build up, enrich that model with the whole panoply of standard controls that economists put in growth regressions. And you can't make these results go away. You can ask about nonlinearities. You can ask whether the more inequality you have, does it affect the shape of the inequality growth relationship? You can ask about nonlinearities in the redistribution dimension. If you're already doing a lot, we don't find any evidence of nonlinearities. That's going to change in a second when I do the hazards. So basically, this idea of a leaky bucket that Arthur Oken championed many decades ago doesn't find much support in the macroeconomic data. It doesn't mean that there aren't leaks in some buckets, but it does mean that on average, the kinds of things that governments have done over these many years and decades and across both developing and developed countries has not been harmful to growth. And it means that the resulting improvements in equality that those redistributive policies have engendered have been helpful to growth and more than offset any potential adverse effects from the redistributive policies themselves. This is a picture that shows those favorable growth effects from redistribution. Likewise, on the side of growth spells, again asking whether inequality tends to make growth more fragile, we find robustly that it does. We ask whether redistributive policies tend to make growth more fragile. we find here an interesting nonlinearity. We find that if you do a moderate amount of redistribution, that tends to be benign in terms of its impact on the sustainability or durability of growth. But if you're in the top quartile of the redistribution distribution, so if you are doing quite a lot of redistribution, the direct effect of redistributive policies is actually harmful to the sustainability of growth. Now remember, you might still, even if you are in this, to use this word, an extreme redistributor, want to pursue such redistributive policies, because there will also be an indirect effect operating through the greater equality that those redistributive policies engender, be a direct benefit, a direct dividend, an indirect dividend to growth. And so what it turns out is that for average or moderate redistributors, just like in the panel growth regressions, redistribution is a win-win pro-growth policy. For extreme redistributors, we can't tell. So one might then want to ask how robust are these results? The results on this is a picture of sort of the largest countries in the world and where they lie on the redistribution distribution, i.e. countries below and to the right of the dashed diagonal line are countries that do quite a lot of redistribution, are in the top quartile. And this is a picture of the effects of redistributive policies on growth, both for moderate or average redistributors and extreme large redistributors. Just to develop a little bit the intuition, economists believe that the costs of redistributive policies are convex, i.e. they rise at a rising rate. This is basic economic theory. So the finding that redistribution is more harmful once it becomes extreme accords with basic principles of economics. Robustness. To cut a long story short, the results on the panel growth regressions are extremely, extremely robust. Robust to estimation technique, robust to the sample, robust to the data source. The results on the hazard regressions, the sustainability analysis, is less robust. And in particular, these data that SOLT has put together vary in terms of their quality. And the data for developing countries from earlier years is suspect. And you can therefore restrict the samples in various ways to include only the highest quality data in the SOLT database. Once you do that and you're looking at growth spells, you lose a lot of the earlier spells, which means that your sample size, remember the unit of observation here is a spell, shrinks a lot, and it then becomes very difficult for the data to speak loudly, and so those results are indeed more fragile. So last slide, my conclusion, which I'm going to read out. Controlling for redistribution inequality is a robust determinant both of the pace of medium-term growth and of the duration of growth spells. There's little evidence of a harmful effect of fiscal redistribution at a macro level. We are mindful about overinterpreting these results, especially for policy purposes, but the extreme caution about redistribution, and thus the inaction, is unlikely to be appropriate in a lot of country cases. On average, across countries and over time, governments' efforts to redistribute have not led to bad growth outcomes unless they were extreme, and the resulting narrowing of inequality has helped to support faster and more durable growth. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Austri, for, sorry you had so short time to present what is impressive piece of empirical work, and of course I think we all celebrate that you and the IMF, being an influential institution, is doing this kind of work on some very important issues. So, Jose Antonio, your turn.
Well, I'm going to speak in the lingua franca of the world, which is badly spoken English, okay? You know, or English with foreign accent. Despite being in Lima and, you know, and let me say that, you know, how glad I am here to be here at the ILO in this panel, which I'm going to actually to present some results of an ongoing research that we are doing for the ILO, actually, which is very much akin to what Jonathan just presented, except that the focus is on the role of universal social protections, and of course on Latin America only. Okay, so it's to see to what extent universal social protection is good or bad. And so some of the results are going to be quite similar. So, in the case of Latin America, of course, first of all, we are at the end of a very, very successful period, more in social terms than in economic terms, I would say, because of the huge decline in poverty and the improvement, the very uncommon, the same improvement in income distribution that took place, uncommon by the region's history and by the world's standards. But then also, you know, I guess taking the issue of the last part of the title of this panel about the effects that may come out with the significant slowdown that is taking place in Latin America, and in which there is evidence, of course, that that some of these you know, good outcomes have already stopped, and the question is, you know, how to move forward. So for this, what we did is try to see if we could get you know, a lot of heterogeneous data in one index of social protection, which has three dimensions: how universal the system is, how the measure of solidarity, which is the access of the very poor to the system, and social spending, which you know, does imply the size of the redistribution, let's say. And with that, excuse me, we get this data for 2002 and 2011, in which we end up classifying the systems of Latin America in three groups: the comprehensive, the intermediate, and the limited. The comprehensive being Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica, Argentina, and Brazil. And then you can say the limited are actually mostly Central American countries, but also Bolivia. But also the magnitudes of the improvements are interesting by themselves, and I guess following Jose Manuel's comments, they involve right-wing regimes and left-wing regimes. Aside, I mean, when you see, for example, among the comprehensive, the most important advance is Argentina. In the intermediate is Colombia and Peru, as well as Dominican Republic. And in the limited, the major improvement is Bolivia. So it's, you know, really countries of different leanings. Now, the facts of social protection in Latin America, we say about significant improvement that I already mentioned, but the fact that there has been much more improvements in health than in pension systems. Pension system become a significant problem. The fact that there is still huge coverage gaps associated to the nature of the employment relation. So a formal labor relation is the way to get coverage. Where, you know, when you don't have a labor relation, you have informal worker or independent worker, you know, the coverage is much lower. So the issue of formality or informality of the labor relation, a central topic for the regional office of the ILO, is a very important issue here. And the social spending has increased almost everywhere. And Latin America is actually probably the best region in the developing world now, but it's still far below the developed countries. So this is some of the issues. The salaried workers in pensions are held versus the non-salaried workers. You know, huge differences between the two groups. But you know, lots of improvements in health, and not so much in pensions. So the development of non-contributory health systems over the last 10 years has been very positive in terms of the coverage of the health systems. And this shows more or less the same by relation to the poorest, 20 and the poorest, and the next quintile of the population. Again, showing the fact that salaried workers are much better covered than non-wage workers or independent workers, and the much greater advance in health relative to education, which in some cases actually even the poorest quintile does have an important improvement, let's say, in terms of the coverage of the health systems. The increase in social spending is generalized. It has taken place for a quarter century, and I think the basics behind this. This is what, in my writings, I call the democratic dividend of Latin America, because the takeoff of this coincides with the generalized return to democracy in Latin America, and it's again extensive. It covers also all political regimes in the region, not only, let's say, the left-wing regimes. In fact, the attempts to find a significant difference between the two has always, for example, Giovanni Cornea tried to do that and came to the conclusion there is not really a significant difference according to the political leanings. And then when you compare, by regions, Latin America is ahead of the, Middle East and North Asia, of Asia and the Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa, but is far behind the advanced countries in terms of the social spending. It's actually also behind emerging Europe, which reflects the fact that emerging Europe, despite the dismantling of many of the benefits during the transition to capitalism in the 1990s, still remain with much better coverages than is typical of the rest of the developing world. Now, some myths of the links between social protection and economic growth. This is, I guess, draws to a large extent from Jonathan's and his collaborators' work at the IMF, but also from other works. So we actually underscore here three myths. The first is that the myth that you have to have higher income in order to have better coverage. I think we'll see we call the affordability myth. The second is that there is the Okun's trade-off, whether it's true or not. And the third is that just by growing, you're going to get better coverage. I would say these are both, the three of them are myths. And on the first myth, there is a clear association, in fact, between GDP per capita and higher social protection, but huge differences on the trend. You can see here, and we have underscored two comparisons. Uruguay versus Mexico. Mexico has a higher per capita income, but Uruguay has much better coverage much better development of social protection, and Costa Rica versus Panama. Again, Panama has a higher per capita income, but much lower levels of social protection than other regions. Okay. Now, on the second and third myth, what we find is that the poverty reduction is not quite true of the inequality because of the Gini evolution of the Gini, but poverty reduction has been much more associated with the expansion of social protection than with growth during this last decade. So this is actually the two graphs. So on the left-hand side, we have the relation between the change in the poverty and the increase in the social protection index that we have. And on the right-hand side is the relation with growth. Both indicate that increasing social protection reduces poverty, increasing growth also reduces poverty, but the effect of social protection is much stronger than the effect of economic growth. So this goes against the interpretation that are in the literature that is just by growing that Latin America has become less poor. What this shows is that those countries that invested during the growth period in improving the social protection system are the ones that were able to reduce poverty the more. Of course, there are significant challenges ahead, and they have to do basically with the fact that we cannot do more of the same, because we're not going to have the same rates of growth going forward, and that there is a significant problem still associated with the informality that I showed previously, that indicate that the independent workers and not formal wage workers are the major problems in terms of social protection. What do we find about the relation between distribution and social protection systems? Essentially, I guess since time is running, let me just emphasize this. I wrote like a paper about 10 years ago, in which I said the best targeting is a universal social protection system. I think that's correct for the basic social policies. So for education and health, there is no question that, in fact, the more universal the system, the better it is in terms of redistribution achieved. And that is also true for social policy as a whole. So the more universal and more extensive your social protection system, the more redistribution you have at one point in time. It's not quite true for transfers, for monetary transfers. Then it is also true that the targeting does matter in terms of the redistributive effect, but that effect is relatively small because the amounts of money involved are small. So what you get in terms of redistribution through, let's say, conditional cash transfers or nutrition programs, which are the typical programs in that regard, is very limited, in fact. I mean, this shows actually the redistributive effect, again, by the three groups of social protection. This is taken actually with the data from the Tulane University Inter-American Dialogue work on redistributive policies in Latin America. And what this shows, first of all, is that there is much more redistribution the more comprehensive the system is. And second, I see the red bars are much larger than the blue bars, and the red bars being basically the in-kind transfers, which are much more important in Latin America than the cash transfers in the region. And this is the overall relation between the redistributive effect and social spending in terms of the reduction in the Gini coefficient through both in-kind and cash transfers. Okay, I'll skip this, which reinforces that, and just leading to the conclusions. So and this has to do a lot of the challenges going ahead. That we still have. I mean, the major problem that we have is that we still have a segmented social protection system according to the labor employment or the employment relation, and this is something that has to advance. There are some innovations that are interesting in terms of trying to cover the informal sector, and we underscore the monotax scheme of Uruguay as a way to get the informal workers into the system. And there are others. For example, the Colombian system in health is actually one of the most interesting in this regard. There is no trade-off between higher redistribution and growth. In fact, what we find is that the more you invest in extending your social protection system, the better results you have, particularly in terms of poverty reduction. And the redistributive impact is higher for universal policy. So my old conclusion that the best targeting is a universal social policy continues to be true generally for in-kind. And then finally, that going forward, the most important issue is the formalization in the labor market, because without that, we actually, we are at the end of what can be achieved with the old system. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio, for a very, very clear, very informative presentation, and so some very important insights. I think that last point there, that is clear, and is something the ILO we have been, of course, focusing a lot on the importance of productive inclusion unemployment and the labor market and the interaction of this with the social protection. Y ahora, Isabel, por favor.
Thank you very much, Jose Manuel. With this event, we are launching a new publication, The Decade of Adjustment, a review of austerity trends 2010-2020 in 187 countries. And this publication is an update that we keep doing periodically. It's a common publication from several institutions, ILO, IPD at Columbia University, and the South Center. And from today, it will be available online. So what I'm going to present is the results of the analysis of fiscal consolidation trends in 187 countries, and bring a bit of reflection on how are we going to reduce inequality and promote universal social protection at times of fiscal consolidation. To set the scene, I always like to present a visualization of how is the distribution of world income. This is work that was done, we did in UNICEF, based on 141 countries, and what is expressing is how much the top 20% has compared to the other quintiles. At the bottom, the poorest 20%. And what you see, this is the most possible conservative analysis that you can do, which is adjusting by PPP. And what you see is that by any metric counting, the top 20% has more than 70% of global income. And the bottom actually has very limited. And in the meantime, in the middle, you do have the middle quintiles, or the so-called middle classes, which have actually not a significant amount of income. This type of diagram, it's very similar in most countries, no matter the percentages might vary a bit. And we estimated that there is a limited amount of progress. You see the darker color represents 1990, and then the lighter blue represents 2007. However, progress is really very limited. For the bottom quintile, the poorest 20%, to have 10% of world income, it will take 800 years at the current speed. So certainly, things are, business as usual is not possible, and we do need to evaluate other ways on how to have policies that will reduce inequality, to change the scene. Now, what happens, however, is that during the global crisis or the current recession, there are all indications that inequality is being increased. We actually did work to study what were the main transmission channels that the crisis impact households. And you do have negative impacts through employment and income, through prices, given the prices of basic food, agricultural input, fuel, medicines, and others have been rising, assets and credits, as well as government spending on economic and social sectors. And this is what we're going to present now, is the trends on fiscal consolidation. And they do have an impact in reducing subsidies, wage bill cuts and caps, reforming pensions and health, targeting social protection and other adjustment measures. And finally, there are also negative impacts on aid levels, given that ODA appears to be reducing in majority of countries. Now, at the beginning of the crisis, it was quite interesting because in the years 2008, 2009, actually you did get an increase in social protection in a majority of world countries. We did look at 50 countries that had fiscal stimulus plans and estimated that about 25% of those plans were invested vaguely in social protection measures. So initially in these 2 years, you did have at least an expansion of social protection. But the key is what happens after 2010. Now what you have here is the number of countries contracting year on year since 2008 to 2020, which is the latest. And this is based on the IMF World Economic Outlook of the fiscal projections of April 2015, of this year. So the latest we had when we were working on it. So the number of countries, as you see in the first phase of the crisis in 2008, 2009 is very low, very small. And then you get the first shock in 2010-11, in which a significant amount of countries, about 113, world countries contract, and the amount of contraction is quite significant. It's an average of 2.3% of GDP. And then countries actually mellow down that path of adjustment. But what is more interesting to look at is that according to IMF WEO, from 2016 onwards, we're getting a second shock. A second amount of, significant amount of countries contracting public expenditures. On average, 127 countries per year, starting in 2016 by 132 countries. And very interestingly, what the different colors mean is that the darker color is the amount of developing countries. So contrary to public perception that, portrayed by the news that adjustment is only happening in Europe, the reality is that if you look in terms of public expenditures, the impact is much larger in developing countries than not really in higher income economies. Further, when we compare expenditure, the contraction of expenditures to pre-crisis level, that is 2005 to 2007, we found that about 30% of world countries are undergoing excessive contraction. That means that they're cutting below the levels of expenditures that they had prior to the crisis. This is in terms of GDP. And this is something worrisome, really, if we are to attain the sustainable development and goals. And you have here in this count countries that are significantly needed of investments, like Eritrea, Yemen, Sudan, Bhutan, you go up, Iraq, Jordan, Angola, Iran, and all the countries. These are all based, you can find the list on the publication. But still, it should put a word of caution on why do we need so much, contraction of expenditures and the impacts they are going to have in terms of, households. Now, to understand, so how are countries contracting or cutting expenditures? So what we did is looking at IMF, the policy discussions contained in IMF country reports. And actually, we looked since February 2010 to February 2015, and that was a lot of work. That was 616 IMF country reports. And so what we did is looking at how the discussions were going, what were the main topics and where the expenditures were contracting, how we're based. So we found that actually 132 countries are talking about reduction of subsidies, and that might include food, fuel, particularly fuel, and also agricultural subsidies. This is most a measure that this has more prevalence actually in developing countries than in advanced economies. Then about 130 countries are discussing about wage bill cuts and caps. That means, keeping the wage bill, the salary of civil servants, or the number of civil servants, either, freeze or reduced. And also, it has more incidence in developing countries than in higher income economies. About 107 countries are talking about targeting the safety net. And this is something very interesting because we found that in most of these IMF country reports, clearly they don't read you. They seem to identify poverty reduction with targeting programs. Now, this is not a direct thing. Actually, the targeting programs very often is a contraction of programs. And we're talking about the need of universal programs. So, you might be targeted to the poorest to ensure that at least these people do have compensation in a time of low growth. But however, it does not mean that you are expanding, at a time that is needed. Then about 105 countries are talking about pension reforms. And this is again worrisome because as José Antonio Campo was presenting, it is very important for reducing inequality as well as poverty to have comprehensive social security systems that will include both contributory and non-contributory elements, schemes. And however, where the trend we are seeing is that there are reforms on the contributory systems and then accompanied by a few cash transfers to the poorest, to the safety nets. But that formula does not appear is going to have positive impacts on reducing inequality. On the contrary, very likely is going to increase it. Then, as many as 89 countries are talking about a number of labor reforms that are expected to bring flexibility to the labor force and very likely have negative impacts on households. 56 countries are talking about health reforms, including user fees and others, which is also worrisome because it's likely to have a negative impact on inequality. And then there are two more reforms that we have added because they appear constantly in the reports. This is not about cutting expenditures, not about contraction. However, they do have generally negative impacts on households. One is the increase of consumption taxes like VAT, and the other is privatization of government, state, and assets. Okay, so this is how you get the incidence percentage of countries. So you see it's not just the number of countries, and what you can see is the incidence is very large in the reduction of subsidies, in the wage bill cuts and caps, in the targeting of safety nets, pension reforms, and labor reforms. More than 50% of world countries are doing them. This is more discussion as I was presenting. Here, what is critical to understand is that the elimination of subsidies, and I'm going to go to the next one. The issue of subsidies is very interesting because, in a way, we all looked positively to the reduction, particularly of fuel subsidies, because it was a, subsidy going to negative from a number of aspects. However, generally what we find at replication almost in all country discussions, policy discussions, is that you reduce the fuel subsidy and then put a very well-targeted safety net to the poor as a compensation mechanism. And now what we need to realize is that this is punishing the middle classes, because subsidies are universal. And they might not be, they might have negative externalities on environment and others, but still they're benefiting everybody, including the middle classes. Now, you remove the subsidy and just replace it by a well-targeted safety net to the poorest. The problem here is that you punish these middle classes, who are going to find higher food and transport costs, higher energy costs, and others. And then in the discussions also appears evidence of some problematic issues that they need to be pointed. One is the timing. Now, subsidies can be reduced overnight. You can just remove it. But to design a well-functioning safety net to the poor or a universal social protection system, it really takes a long time to happen. So these discussions are happening, subsidies are being removed, and at a time when populations are left more vulnerable, actually very often they're left uncovered because it takes a number of months or years to build a well-functioning system. And the other issue is about the allocation of cost savings. Actually, the cost savings coming from fuel subsidies are very large. We're talking about significant percentages of GDP. And however, very often these very well-targeted safety nets, and let me give you the example of Ghana, they are ridiculous in amount. In Ghana, the fuel subsidy, it was costing about $1 billion in 2013, and then it got removed and then replaced by a very well-targeted social protection program that only cost $20 million per year. Now, this enormous amount of cost savings could serve to design proper universal systems that will benefit all citizens in other way. So in a way, the Ghana case shows that it was a lost opportunity to do something more interesting. And continuing with that, the target to the poorest is very problematic in a very significant amount of countries. For instance, it appears in the country discussions of Gambia, Haiti, Mali, Mauritania, Nicaragua, Senegal, Sudan, Timor-Leste, Togo, or Zambia. These are countries where about half of the population is below the poverty line. So targeting to the poorest of the poor, the reality is you are leaving out a significant number of people that are highly vulnerable. No matter even that they might be above the poverty line, and they might need support. So this is why the allocation of these cost savings should be properly analyzed in national debate and not as simply, be allocated to a small program targeting to the poor. Well, then we look using the United Nations global policy model. We see the impacts on growth, and actually we look the model shows that there is a significant negative impact on growth in all regions, both high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low income. The most affected regions in which they have negative impacts on growth of this trend towards fiscal consolidation are the upper middle income countries and low income countries, which actually give us also concern on why fiscal consolidation needs to be promoted so significantly. Also, that has negative impacts on jobs. We know that in Europe, the compound effects of low growth, less jobs, and cuts in social protection systems added by a targeting to the general minimum income to the bottom people actually has increased poverty significantly by the millions. Actually, at the moment, and according to Eurostat, 24% of the European population is at risk of poverty. And the increases, which is the darker color you find, is what has happened since 2008 to 2012. And you see a significant increase in a number of countries. So, to conclude, it does not really need to be a decade of adjustment. The United Nations have been repeatedly warning about how austerity or fiscal consolidation is likely to bring the global economy down into further recession and increase inequality. If governments opt for adjustment or for fiscal consolidation, we should really examine the pace and intensity of fiscal consolidation. You don't need to do it as significant and as intense and in short time in a manner that is, in the shock that is predicted to happen from 2016 to 2020. Perhaps it can be done in a more mellow path and allowing for adequate necessary socioeconomic investments for development. And actually, a number of countries have done it. The majority of world countries were expected to keep contracting as sharply as it was expected, as the path was in 2010 and 11. However, they mellowed down in 2012 to 2015. So countries can continue doing the same. And if they do opt for cutting public expenditures, they can actually cut them, but they still preserve, wages, adequate subsidies, and expand social protection and health systems. As there's a significant number of countries in our study, we see that they are doing. They're cutting expenditures, but still they're doing the necessary investments. So thank you very much. It was great to present you here the findings of our work with ILO, IPD Columbia University, and the South Center, and the paper is available online from today onwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Isabel. It does not need to be a decade of adjustment. This keeps coming back. We'll see if there's time to discuss that. Okay, Peter Baptist, your turn.
Ok, gracias, José Manuel. Voy a seguir el ejemplo de los otros ponentes y hablar en inglés. I will make a few comments on the ILO's most recent work, and we have the paper, as Isabel mentioned, online, Social Protection Global Policy Trends 2010-2015. Hopefully maybe you'll make a Spanish language version available of that as well. And I will then finish on a couple of comments on two specific subjects. One, social safety nets versus universal social protection, which Jose Manuel and Isabel touched on a little bit. Jose Antonio. And secondly, with developments in labor market institutions, which, as you can understand from a trade union organization, interest us particularly. I do wish to compliment the ILO and the Social Protection Department on the work that it has been doing on the effects of fiscal consolidation. And this paper, which is, I think, almost brand new, is just the latest in work that Isabel and her colleagues have been carrying out. which really does document very well and in great detail fiscal consolidation, much more widespread than one would think with some general impressions. And I won't repeat the number of countries, but also goes into the impact, a little bit into the intellectual origins. She mentioned some papers produced by the IMF in early 2010. I do think, not that I'm an expert in this and I propose a discussion, but I think there was a political shift that explains it as well. I mean, my perception is there were games within the G20, and it was largely an ideological shift at the time around 2010 that led to the shift to austerity or fiscal consolidation. This has been criticized by many. I'd just like to mention that in 2014, a year ago, the IMF's own independent evaluation office put out a very interesting analysis of the shift to austerity and concluded that the shift to austerity was premature and probably contributed to the global slowdown, economic slowdown, which is intensifying, as we saw in the World Economic Outlook update that was presented by the IMF's chief economist on Tuesday. Workers sometimes have the impression that they paid twice for the global crisis that started in 2008. First, when a dysfunctional global financial system almost collapsed, and this led to a spike in unemployment and underemployment, what Dominique Strauss-Kahn named the Great Recession. There was a brief interlude of approximately 2 years where the global community did get together, and the G20 for a couple of years assumed leadership. And with, I think, some support from institutions like the IMF to undertake stimulus policies that did lead to some increase of protection for the unemployed and others who suffered from the Great Recession. However, if one reads a footnote on page 17 of the latest ILO paper, the amounts actually spent for increased social protection were really quite minuscule as compared to the amounts that were spent to rescue and bail out the financial sector. So that has to be put in perspective. But then since 2010, 2011, of course, we've gone through what's called fiscal consolidation or austerity, cutbacks of various government programs, and these again have been largely paid for by workers. So it's in this sense that workers have the impression they paid twice for the crisis. Things like reductions in unemployment benefits, fees for access to health care, and many others. And on the other side, as we saw in the presentation from Isabel, tax increases most typically occurred through consumption tax increases, value-added taxes and so on, which in general are regressive unless one puts in place specific compensatory mechanisms. Now, the two themes that I want to develop, as I announced a couple of minutes ago, which I think have been particularly harmful during this phase of fiscal consolidation. One is the development of social safety nets as an alternative, and it really is put in that sense as an alternative to universal social protection. And then I'll say a few words about weakening of labor market institutions. Now, I must say that the latter, the weakening of labor market institutions, are not per se austerity, but they have accompanied austerity, and Isabel listed the number of countries, which is quite impressive. 89 that have undertaken deregulatory labor market reforms of different kinds. And they're supposed to have increased competitiveness of those countries, which I think is highly debatable, and I'll submit a little bit of information about that. Now, in the social safety nets question, the rationale has been when resources are limited, one has to target the poorest and the most vulnerable. Thus, for example, unemployment benefits have been cut back in favor of means-tested welfare payments, or subsidized basic foodstuffs available to all have been replaced by targeted cash transfers. Now, on a simple intellectual moral basis, it's hard to be against giving priority to the poor. In practical terms, there are many problems associated with that approach, and Isabel touched on that, of course, as well. First, there's the capacity to implement targeted measures, and the capacity to implement tends to decrease with the level of GDP per capita in the country. So low-income countries just don't have the data that ensures that all those, the poorest and most vulnerable, have access to, for example, conditional cash transfer programs. The other question is where is the cutoff point for these benefits? I'll give you one practical example because I've worked with the trade unions and we've had dialogue, in fact, with the IMF about that a couple of years ago, which concerns the quite rapid increase of fuel and other energy prices in Egypt due to a subsidy reduction, which has taken place on the basis of IMF advice, although there's no IMF program currently in Egypt. I must say that, by the way, that we think in the labor movement, in the global labor movement, fuel subsidies are a very bad policy. They do tend to be regressive for the most part. They benefit high-income people more than low-income people. And for the environmental impact, it makes no sense to encourage consumption of energy. But the question is not should we work to eliminate them, but the question should be what we replace them with. Now, in the case of Egypt, there was a presentation, by the way, by an Egyptian economist on this subject as well yesterday in the Civil Society Forum over at the IFI meetings. Gave the same data, but like I said, I was engaged in debates a couple of years ago with the IMF and trade unions in Egypt on this. And what we're finding now is that very low-income women workers have suffered a sharp reduction in their real income because the cost of their urban public transport to go to work, although it's it's collective transport, but assured by for the most part, I think, by private providers, those costs have gone up sharply. That represents as much as a quarter of their income, and it's gone. It's gone from 10% to a quarter of their income. These workers are not eligible to the cash transfer programs. They're not in place, and they haven't been compensated by any other kind of measure. If you are asking lower middle income people to contribute to programs from which they will never benefit, it becomes very difficult to sell those kinds of programs versus universal programs that give access to everyone, but that you pay through higher taxes by people who are better off. So second and last topic is a question of labor market institutions. Now we've seen really significant weakening of labor market institutions and regulations over the past 5 years, the period that's covered in Isabel's study, although she doesn't, that study doesn't go into that. Examples are reduced minimum wages, reduced protections against dismissals, making it easier for firms to offer short-term contracts without access to benefits, including health care and pensions, and weakening of collective bargaining institutions. So the consequences, and that is, I think, well documented in other ILO reports, not from Isabel's department, has been an increase in precarious employment. In some countries actual drop in real wages. In some countries, a very sharp reduction of collective bargaining coverage. Now, I must say then, talking specifically about Latin America, we did see a contrary tendency in most Latin American countries, more in South America than Central America, as Jose Antonio and Jose Manuel mentioned, from the early 2000s till about 2010, 2011, there is at best a stagnation right now in the past few years. Now, these kinds of measures have been part of programs that have been promoted by the ILO, sorry, not the ILO, these IMF and other institutions, these labor market flexibility measures. And they have been, the rationale has been that these are necessary to improve the competitiveness of countries. They have to lower labor costs in order to be more competitive on the global market. And we've seen that particularly defended in the Eurozone, where, of course, there's no possibility to adjust exchange rates. Spain, for example, is one country which in fact has been given as an example because in the past year or so, unemployment has fallen from a peak of 27% to about 22% currently. So it's very much a relative success story. I would submit that that is almost entirely due to policies of the European Central Bank and much easier credit conditions now. Small businesses are able to borrow again. Consumers are able to borrow again to buy durable goods. It has nothing to do with supposed increase in competitiveness. And I would just give you, for example, if you compare Spain's trade balance for the first 6 months of 2015 with the first 6 months a year ago, 2014, within the Eurozone, which is the single currency zone, Spain's trade balance has actually fallen by 16%. In that period. So there's no indication that Spain has become more competitive. On the other hand, Germany's trade balances has increased, I think the figure is around 30% during that same period. So this internal rebalancing, which is supposed to have been the positive impact of what's sometimes called internal devaluation. You lower wages because you can't lower the exchange rate, has simply not happened. However, the negative consequences, I think, are evident. There's been already an impoverishment of the working class, signs of increased inequality. And I think from what we've seen from the other presenters, including Jonathan Ostry from the IMF, these are obviously tendencies to deplore because of the long-term consequences they will have, not just in distribution of income, but on economic stability and economic growth. I do very much, we very much appreciated the work that we followed, that Jonathan and some of his colleagues have done. I think starting about 2009 2011. There's also some more recent work, for example, a paper published just in July on labor markets and inequality that, in addition, make the association between lower collective bargaining coverage, lower minimum wages, and sharp increases in inequality. So these are issues that I think if we're serious about wanting to build more equal societies, not just because they're for moral, ethical reasons, but they make a lot of economic sense as well, we would want to counteract that. And I do find it unfortunate that IMF practices, that is, on the ground, country level loan conditions or policy advice, seem to be about 30 years behind some of the research that is being produced by Jonathan and some of his other colleagues. So, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. I'm just asking here, we have Jonathan for 5 more minutes, so if there is any question particularly to him, maybe we can remain another 5 minutes or we close up. But if there's any comment or question while Jonathan is still here. I have one. Oh, so there's one. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your terrific presentations. I have a question about the implication of population aging for social protection and for the fiscal issues in Latin America, now that we are particularly in the midst of demographic dividend. But at the same time, aging is very, very fast in our countries. We have the implication for social protection of this in the next few years, next decades.
Yeah, okay, we'll do that, yes. Yeah, Jonathan, my question to you really is, see, I think it was fascinating, excellent, but you argue that the narrowing of the inequality generally helps faster and more durable growth. But how is this affected by market size? I mean, in the sense, one thinks in a country like Brazil, where of course a small amount of reduction in inequality in a huge market can have a big impact, a little bit like an engine of growth by itself. But if you have a small country in Central America, because of the market size, probably the impact is very small. How in the methodology is that effect taken into account?
Thank you very much. We didn't explicitly test for market size, but our sample includes small and large countries. If you think of the channels that might be operating, I'm not sure they would be weaker in small countries. I mean, poor people tend to spend a larger fraction of their income, so from a demand point of view, greater equality would tend to support aggregate demand. The political stability channel, the greater access to education, nutrition, health, financial markets, they would operate in both small and large countries. The resilience channel, what Danny Roderick has emphasized, that more equal societies are more socially cohesive and thus able to better respond to shocks. So I think it's an interesting hypothesis. We did not test for it, but my sense is that a lot of the channels that I think might lie behind this relationship would not really depend on country size, would be my sense.
Yes.
Go ahead. No.
Okay, well, we understand you have to go, so thank you very, very much for participating in this panel. Good luck with the rest of the annual meetings.
Thank you so much.
And maybe we can say 5 or 10 minutes if there's no objection for other comments that we might have in the room. Okay, thank you.